again, and welcome back to the StratCom COE webinar series. And I'm sorry for the initial technical difficulties. I hope it didn't cancel your plans and you are still there looking forward to the interesting discussion. So my name is Sanda Svetoka and I'm the expert of the StratCom Center of Excellence, and I will be moderating a talk today on a rather exciting topic which is called social media platform regulation. Discussion on how to mitigate harmful effects algorithmic bias or spread of misinformation and disinformation, and what role and responsibility social media platforms should play in that. That kind of discussion have been under radar already for several years. However, this issue has become more pressing than ever because of some recent developments, such as we have seen some kind of political impact of platform activities, such as banning account of the US president or pushback of Facebook to Australia's attempt to make tech giants to pay for media news. We have also seen recent policy initiatives in the EU which demonstrate that disinformation and social media regulation have become a top priority. Also, at the StratCom Center of Excellence, we have analyzed the performance of social media in mitigating inauthentic behavior. And we have found that actually social media manipulation is easily done. It is accessible, it's cheap, and unfortunately not always social media platforms are capable to mitigate the effects of the inauthentic behavior. So basically there is no question anymore whether some form of regulation of online environment is needed. The question is whether the questions are why and how and by whom this online environment should be regulated. And to discuss those issues, we have invited two, I would say, very interesting experts to speak here, and one of them is Lubos Kuklis and Felix Kartte. So welcome. Lubos is chief executive at the Slovak Media Authority, and previously he has been a chair of European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services, ERGA, and currently he leads its work on disinformation. And last year, ERGA published the assessment report on the implementation of the EU Code of Practice on disinformation. And Lubos frequently speaks at public events and cooperates with international institutions to find solutions on how to mitigate the spread of disinformation and discuss the regulations in the digital environment. And he will be joined by another expert, Felix Kartte, who is a senior advisor at RESET, which is an initiative which is focusing on the regulation of online media. And in this organization, he is helping to increase the resilience of Germany's upcoming digital election campaign. Previously, Felix was a policy officer at the EU, where he helped to shape the EU's agenda on online disinformation and countering digital threats. I will now give the floor to Lubos, who will tell us more about the main trends and approaches in social media regulation and the problematic related to it. But before I do that, I really welcome you to ask questions, to post comments, and to be active in this discussion by posting your comments and questions on our social media channels on Facebook and YouTube. So, Lubos, now I will give the floor to you for your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much for having me here. I always find it interesting to debate these things and to work in the digital environment, and especially in regulation right now. It's extremely exciting because of everything that is happening, and that we are looking for to find solutions. And it's not easy. but we need to try, and one of the ways how to do it is to debate everything in detail. So thanks again for having me here. So what I would do in this introduction, or what I would like to do, is to give you a perspective on what is happening, or what are rules currently around social media, and what are the trends toward the new rules that are coming from, especially from the EU, because we have new initiatives there, and how to distinguish the content that is deemed illegal and that already have some rules, and the content that is not illegal but may be harmful, like disinformation, and what to do about that. So very briefly, in the US, the framework for legislative framework there is dictated by one small provision in a law that is called Communication Decency Act, and this provision is called Section 230. And this Section 230 limits liability of the intermediaries, and to that extent, and it was developed later on by courts, that it limits really any responsibility of the intermediaries for anything that is put online by users or other providers. Now there are some exceptions to it by now, but I think the general rule is that the intermediaries, and that includes also social media, are really not responsible for anything that the user are putting online. Now, in contrast, in the EU, we have those rules that are covering this area in the so-called e-commerce directive. And although there is a limited liability, or there's a limitation on liability, it is not that extensive as the one in the US. And it means that, for example, we have a limited liability saying that if the intermediaries are notified about the content that might be illegal on their service, they either put it down or do something about it to retain the limited liability, the shield of the limited liability, or they are becoming responsible for that kind of content. And the second very important distinction from the US is that this limited liability doesn't cover injunctions, so-called injunction by courts. So, for example, courts can't issue a decision and require the intermediaries to put down content, or to block that content for the users, or to do something about it otherwise. But it means that intermediaries are not shielded from these kind of injunctions. And this is the different approach, and now it is debated on both sides of the Atlantic. You can see in the US a heated debate around the Section 230, and now there is a proposal by Democrats to change it. And we see also proposals now in Europe, like DSA, that is directly trying to amend and expand the rules in the e-commerce directive. But I will talk a bit later on that. What I would like to say now is that that social media, why, for example, there's always a question why social media can't be treated as media. We have a lot of rules on traditional media like broadcasting. And there is a very important distinction. It is not editorial responsibility in the kind of all the kind of media that they have, because the principal creator, the principal uploader there is the user. So you can't just have the same dynamic as we had before, where you had an editorial responsibility between in the media, and all the rights like freedom of speech or freedom of media in general lie with the media. And on the other hand, you had a public interest represented by legislation and regulator, and everything happened in between, and you were just balancing these two. Now you have a third element, and that's the user, and it's primarily the user for whom rights and responsibilities you now have to focus on in the legislation if you want to deal with anything in this kind of environment. And that, therefore, it is really hard to deem social media responsible for every item that is on the services. Now, there's an approach around that, and we call it systemic kind of regulation. And we already have a legislation that is looking at the social media in this way, and it's written in the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, and it is directed against social media that carry any video content, and these are called video sharing platforms in the directive. And in the directive, they are not taken responsible for every single item that is there, but they are responsible for distribution of the content they have and for the systemic treatment of that content. Now, in this directive, this is the first time anywhere in the world that I know that this systemic approach is taken. But also, this directive is dealing also with harmful content. So it's not only illegal content that is already illegal in criminal law, for example, but also content that is deemed harmful to children, and a few other things like advertising and so on. Now, if we are talking about that harmful content in wider perspective, it is really hard now. For example, in the e-commerce directive, we have only rules against illegal content. And now, if you see the proposal for Digital Services Act, it is also the hard rules there are also directed only against illegal content. So now, what to do with, for example, disinformation, as you talked about earlier on? Now, this is extremely difficult for that reason, because disinformation per se, lying per se, is not illegal. So if you have it online, what kind of rules you can have that wouldn't diminish the freedom of speech in a disproportionate way. So there are in the EU there are developing now new approaches to that, and one of them is so-called code of practice. That is a kind of agreement between the major social media to put their measures against dissemination of disinformation. Now, this has been around for 2 years now, and ERGA, as I've been working with ERGA, and I'm now representing ERGA in that respect. We are trying to monitor that development and are trying to put forward for the Commission and others the proposals how to make it better. And now we have a new initiative within EU put forward by the EU Commission called European Democracy Action Plan, and part of that is aimed at disinformation, and part of that is aimed at a new code of practice. We call it, colloquially as Code of Practice 2.0, where we are trying to implement the things that we found during the monitoring. And if we find time, we can go into details in that later on. And I would like to say a few words about the Digital Services Act, because this is something that is going to affect the digital environment in a considerable way. And I think it is important now to say that what is trying to do is to be more, to allow regulators to be more active against illegal content. It is the first time that what is proposed there is actual regulation. It is not given to the courts to deal with everything. There is a regulatory structure put forward by the Commission in the proposal that is creating a kind of a regulatory approach that, in a sense of administrative law, and that might be effective in the future. But it also looked at strengthening the rules around advertising, for example. And what is probably most important right now, there are rules on the transparency of the social media platforms, the transparency of their own frameworks of rules that they are putting forward when they are moderating content, and the transparency around algorithms that are distributing content. And another aspect of that, renovation of all the digital rules framework is Digital Markets Act. Is looking at social media and platforms, because it's not only social media, from this perspective of the market, and is trying to aim at preventing the strongest player to abuse their market power to diminish the others from exploring opportunities in the market. So I would stop here, because I think 7 minutes have already gone. So I'm looking forward to any debate and any questions that might stem from our debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lubos, for giving a good overview of what is new out there. So what are the new trends, and what are the new plans for regulating this space even more. So maybe a bit of provocative question. So do you think there could be too much of regulation? Can there be any negative consequences to being this space being too much regulated? So maybe you can elaborate more on that.
It is a possibility, and we have to be really careful when trying to make a regulation in that area. the freedom of expression, freedom of media is something extremely valuable for democracies. And if you, overregulate things, if you're pushing to the companies, on the companies too much, it may be that they will have own rules that will just, prohibit, the expressions that otherwise would be allowed. It might make the democracy and the discussion more vibrant. And of course, the thing is, what we are seeing now in the digital environment is that own rules of the platforms are maybe so strict that there are many legitimate kind of expressions that are just going away from that environment and are put down, for example. So the one thing is really, it is not only that you are limiting the liability of these platforms from any harm doing, but also there has to be some kind of protection for users that are putting things up there, that are uploading content, from getting their content put down by the platforms, with rules that we, very often we don't know, anything about, or we don't know how they function. So it is really a very complex problem, and you have to look at that from all sides. And the most important are, you want the platforms to be active against, harmful or illegal content. On the other hand, you need also protect users. So this is an extremely complex situation. And I think what we currently have on the table with Digital Services Act is a very good basis for that discussion. I think it's quality-wise, it's a very good proposal. But there are things, there are details that we need to get right.
Thank you, Lubos. With this, I think we can transform freely to our next speaker, to Felix, who could discuss more about those finding perhaps right balance between this regulation and freedom of speech principles, and which is complex issue, as Lubos already mentioned, and it's not always about being legal or not illegal. So Felix, could you elaborate more on this challenge?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me, first of all. And indeed, I think you touch on a very important issue there. I don't think we should think of platform governance only in terms of this take down or leave up dichotomy. I think that is really not productive. And I feel like, especially after Twitter's Trump ban, the deplatforming of a sitting president, then I think the policy discussion is taking a few awkward turns in the EU. Several EU leaders, including Merkel, Germany's chancellor, for instance, somehow suggested after the ban that social media companies should not be allowed to take down any content that is not illegal. Poland and Hungary, and as far as I'm aware, even proposed creating new laws allegedly to protect free speech that would prohibit platforms to take down harmful content that is, however, not illegal. And I think that's a bit of a dangerous idea. And it's actually a far-right narrative that has been around in Europe and in the US for a long time. And the flawed assumption, in my view, seems to be that content moderation is the same as censorship, which is clearly not. And I think this equation, this claim makes us look a little bit schizophrenic, because at the same time, we and the EU institutions, for instance, do so all the time, ask the platforms to take action against disinformation, so against content that is by definition not illegal. In Germany, we have several key elections this year at national and regional level, and our right-wing party, the Alternative für Deutschland, have already begun running Facebook ads with outright racist content. They are already spreading across social media the election fraud narrative that Trump used in the US to incite basically a big share of the population. And of course, I want Facebook to be allowed to take down that kind of stuff. I think that's actually very important to create safe civic spaces for democratic engagement. But I think they should do so and apply their content policies consistently and transparently, and as Lubos also stressed, give users the right to redress and provide several kinds of fundamental right safeguards. In fact, actually, a German court a while ago ruled that it was completely legal and okay for Facebook to take down accounts and content linked to the hate group called 1%, 1%, even though there was no necessarily illegal content involved. I think there's another problem there, though, because I think that we are actually doing Facebook and the other platforms a large favor if we discuss disinformation in terms of content moderation all the time, as if like more content takedowns could solve the problem. I don't think that's the case. I think that we should talk much less, for instance, about Facebook's oversight board and these other like initiatives they're giving us to what I think is a distraction, to distract us from the real problem and the real harm and externalities that their business model causes to society and to the democratic processes. And I think what we need to talk about more, and that's also what the DSA does and what Lubos just did, is the large-scale amplification of disinformation, the many ways in which these companies make democratic societies vulnerable to interference and manipulation. Just to give some examples from the recent US election experience, it came out that Facebook had already conducted research in 2016 that demonstrated that more than 60% of people that follow extremist pages and profiles on Facebook did so because of Facebook's own recommender system, so because of algorithmic recommendations that had a radicalizing effect clearly in that regard. And still now in this election cycle in 2020, Facebook allowed their algorithms to massively amplify inciting rhetoric and calls for violence and hate speech that ultimately led to the insurrection that we all saw on TV and on social media at Capitol Hill. I think that's at least my wishful thinking, that under the DSA, if it were effective, this would be a great moment for regulators to step in and impose a fine on Facebook for what I think is a gross negligence. What I also really like about the DSA are all the provisions on data access and transparency. For instance, while I was still working with the EU institutions, with the EU team working on disinformation, Facebook would often come to us with a lot of PR fanfare and tell us that they had taken down millions of accounts for spreading disinformation, or that they had suspended 5 inauthentic networks from Russia. Those figures, like, they sound great and they make for great headlines, but they're of no use to a democratic society or government if nobody can verify them. So I think all like data access and auditing provisions are most welcome. So Lubos just mentioned systemic regulation. I think that's exactly how we should think about issues such as disinformation as well, rather than in terms of content policies and takedown quotas or whatever. And yeah, I think it's really about forcing platforms to be transparent and diligent and to bring their business model more in line with the public interest. And yeah, I look forward to discussing how specifically that can be the case under the new policy initiatives.
Thank you, Felix, very much. Very interesting points. In reaction to your speech, I already have a first question coming from audience, and actually it's one of our StratCom colleagues, and I think it's quite interesting who should be the ones responsible for regulating the freedom of speech, and the question is, isn't it more dangerous to leave the issue of regulating freedom of speech up to private companies, basically leaving it up to social media platforms?
I don't think so. And I think, to be honest, that this is a little bit of a one-dimensional understanding of freedom of speech, because we need diverse, basically, speech ecosystems. We need diverse, like, content moderation policies as offerings to users, so they can choose where to basically allow their children to go online. If we were forcing platforms to leave all kinds of content that is outrightly hateful but just underneath the threshold of illegality online, I don't think the internet or social media in particular would be a good space for anybody, basically. So I think we have to also think about the freedom of speech of vulnerable groups, for instance, in society who would be crowded out of online space by hate campaigns and the massive amplification of harmful content if social media companies were not allowed to take action against that.
Lubos, do you agree, or would you have anything to add to those points?
Well, I think, if I understood the question completely, I think I think I did. It was rhetoric, but the thing is that no, I think you can't just leave that large portion of our lives to individual private companies to deal with everything that is happening on them. I think that the democratic legitimacy lies with the different institutions. But at the same time, I think you can't just take it all away from them. I think, you have to find a middle way where you have, those things connected. And, in many fields, we are doing what we call co-regulation. And I think we can, use that experience also here. With the systemic kind of regulation, it is even practically not feasible, to overlook everything that the platforms are doing. You have to have, them a leeway, a kind of freedom to do things that they would like to do on their platforms. But you have to, put there some limitations, some constraints on what they are able to do. But also on the other hand, to give protections to users, what the platforms can't do to users, for example. So Felix was mentioning that, a kind of redress, the opportunity to appeal, decisions of the platform itself, for example. It is extremely important, and to be transparent about it. Everything, I think, every policy debate should start with transparency. We really know very little what is happening currently on the platforms. So this is extremely important, whether it being, the disinformation problem or any other problem there is there. So that's why I welcome, the provisions of the essay, the proposal now, because it's still not legislation, of course, that is aiming at that direction. And also why I think it's important that the approach of the Commission in the European Democracy Action Plan, is to really make, the fight against disinformation much more transparent. But for that, again, you just can't, trust the platforms, or you can't be just asked to trust platforms for every, transparency measure there is there. You have to have a way of how, again, as Felix said, verify the things that are telling you, the data that are giving you. And this is extremely important. And now we in ERGA, for example, with the Commission, are working precisely on that, how to make that kind of framework where you can have a verification of the data you are given and some kind of accountability structure in that sense.
Yes, and you both talk about the need for enhanced transparency and asking for more transparency from social media platforms or social media providers, and we have a follow-up question here, which is basically in the Digital Service Act. What is the justification of for enhanced transparency requirements being applicable only to the very large online platforms? So why we are talking about the big platforms only, and perhaps leaving out the smaller and fringe spaces, and which perhaps would not be that well regulated? Felix, would you like to talk on that?
So I think there is a slight misconception there, because indeed there are certain transparency requirements in the DSA that apply to all platforms. But I think the reasoning of the DSA is that very large online platforms have kind of a systemic relevance to a democratic society, for users, or for citizens rather, to be able to participate in public discourse and assert their information and speech rights, for instance. It is often almost inevitable and necessary to be on Facebook or YouTube and Instagram. So I think it makes perfect sense to have some broader responsibilities for these large platforms, and to ask them specifically to assess the risks in advance that their business model and their business conduct may cause to society, and then also to to enable a regulator to judge whether their risk assessment is complete and accurate and whether they have done sufficient to have taken sufficient measures to address those risks. So I think we indeed need this kind of layered approach, asymmetric responsibilities. I think the DSA calls it with transparency for all platforms, yes, but special responsibilities for the very large ones.
Would you like to add?
Angle to it is that, you know, we heard, you know, many times before, you know, the arguments against policy on the platform is that, you know, the smaller platforms would not be able to compete because of too burdensome obligations on them. So this is another way how to go around it, that you not put, you know, the most stringent kind of obligations on every platform, but you have that layered approach. On the other hand, there are voices now saying that, you know, we need a more risk-based approach because there may be fringe kind of platforms that are, you know, are putting, you know, people, individuals, children to more harm than the bigger platforms. So I think, you know, again, we have to think about it really hard and debate it really hard. And it may be that we need to combine these approaches. There may be a few things based on a risk-based approach, you know, to see whether the harm is there or not. But not to put obligations on every platform, just, you know, the most strict ones, just reserved for the really big major platforms.
Like follow-up question. Basically, should there be any should the regulations differ in social media sites that encourages real identities, like those big platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and should there be different type of regulation to those which use just pseudonym identities, such as Reddit and Discord? So should there? You already discussed that, saying that there should be some kind of layered or separated approach to that. But do you have any specific to answer to that one? So maybe who wants to start first? Lubos?
I can. I was waiting for Felix to come in, but very quickly, I'm not sure that this is now the distinction that we really need to have. I think, you know, we need a layered approach, but I'm not sure that anonymity is the criterion we should base this on. You know, there are, I know many arguments why anonymity is not good on the internet, but there are many arguments against, you know, that notion, because anonymity brings protection to really marginalized groups in society. And to take that away from them, you know, just to move them on a fringe kind of platforms where they can do that freely, I think you are just taking away a voice from them, you know, for in general discussions that are happening on the major kind of social media. So I wouldn't really subscribe to that distinction, but indeed, you know, it's a kind of consideration that we should put on the table and debate, definitely.
So as Lubos just said, I think anonymity is an important and valuable part of the internet, and I find like this idea of lifting it altogether quite scary. I do think that probably platforms should be forced to share user details when there is a clear illegal act committed by somebody, like sharing child pornography online or whatnot. So in that case, yes. But otherwise, I also don't think that anonymity is the crux here. I think we are trying to focus on the behavior of platforms and how they do their job rather than so much on what users are doing on the platforms in this specific case.
So, and responding to, actually, I have another question responding to what you just said, Felix, about what platforms actually do and what they do with their algorithms to, you know, to push forward certain content. We have a question, basically. I think it's not an easy one, but you can decide how to answer it. Basically, how to tackle the influence of an algorithm of social media platform, because transparency and asking for more transparency might not be enough. So perhaps there might be some other measures taken to basically to mitigate the harmful effects of algorithmic bias or social media platforms using those algorithms for pushing certain content and earning money. So yeah, what would be your take on that?
So I think, in as far as I understand it, and I'm not a lawyer, but democratic governments have a responsibility to create a regulatory environment where citizens can enjoy and assert all of their fundamental rights. So if a regulator like Lubos' team maybe finds out that platform recommender systems and algorithms systematically discriminate against certain population groups, or that they undermine freedom of speech, information freedoms, that they completely diminish information and media pluralism, for instance, I think in that case, adjustments should be required of the platforms. I think we need, first of all, though, of course, this level of transparency and scrutiny to really understand systematically how algorithms impact these different fundamental rights. And this transparency is currently not there. In fact, there are research projects like Who Targets Me, the Citizen browser in the US, who try to do that kind of work. And Facebook, for instance, does everything it can to undermine this research and cover those teams with lawsuits. And yeah, because I think they see it as a threat to their business model much more than any of our discussions about like content policies.
Lubos, would you have anything to add? Perhaps anything from the assessment from ERGA report on the code of conduct? So yeah, you were talking about transparency measures, but is there anything else which can be done apart from asking for more transparency from social media platforms?
Well, I think yes, but you can't really say if you don't have any transparency around what they're doing. To have a policy proposal without knowing what you are changing or influencing, is not very responsible. So I would say, we have to start with transparency. Of course, we have kind of evidence from researchers that are, looking at these things. It's not easy for them to get the data, but some of them are getting the data. And it's not many times, for example, to be concrete, to talk about YouTube, for example, and how it is pushing content. And we have really a good evidence on that. So you can't imagine a regulatory response to that, to either give the user the opportunity to set those recommender systems their own way, or to have at least, some kind of, predetermined way how the recommender system should work, and then let user to tweak it, the way that they would like to, go the most harmful way, for example, all the way down. But, we already know what the response probably should be. But the first thing really is to have an evidence for the evidence-based approach that everybody is calling for, is to have a transparency. So we need to know how the algorithms are working. And it's not, if I may add one thing, is that, the protection from the platforms is always, these are our proprietary systems. If we reveal how they work, it's a business risk on the one hand. On the other, we will teach, the nefarious actors how to game the system. But, you don't have to go that deep in every algorithm. I'm a lawyer, I'm not a data scientist, but what I'm hearing from data scientists is that, you don't have to go into that detail with the algorithms. Basically what you need to know is what data are going in and what data are going out of that system. And that probably should be something to start from.
Thank you. We have another quite interesting question about would you think that consumer product safety approach or mindset should work as a starting point for developing regulation for social media? So it's more about the approach. So should the consumer product safety should be as a starting point for when you are thinking about what should be regulated and how? So maybe Felix can start by answering that.
Well, I guess I will answer it from almost like a philosophical angle, because I lack the specific expertise to give a more concrete answer. But I think the problem is here that a consumer safety approach would require us to be able to really pinpoint and very accurately measure the harm that a specific product causes to a user, like toxic ingredients to a plastic product or whatever. I think that the harms that the platform's current business model causes to society are more diffuse and more abstract than that. So I think indeed this approach of systemic regulation is the most appropriate one.
So Lubos, what is your take on that?
Completely agree. I think the danger that we have currently is that we are looking at the tools that we already have and try to apply to the new situation. I think it was a problem for a long time, that we were having that debate whether the platforms are intermediaries or media. The debate was going back and forth. But they are a new kind of entity, and we need new rules on that. Of course, consumer protection will be to a part an important thing there, because there are things that are being sold during the platforms, for example, and for that area the consumer protection approach is absolutely right, but overall approach should be more wholesome, so to say. So this needs to be risk-based, systemic, these kind of things, and we are developing a new area of law here, so we have to be clear about that. So yeah, take everything that works from other areas, but not be limited to that.
Okay, thank you. I have few questions which are related to, I would say, new trends in malicious use of social media. Basically, asking whether how do we see whether the regulation or the upcoming regulation is addressing the increase of sock puppet accounts and botnets, since they are becoming more complex and advanced, and is there any way to do something about the deep fakes? Does regulation look into that new phenomenon or trend? So yeah, how the new approach to how the regulation is approaching those really, like, I would say, malicious methods of using social media, and yeah, whether they look into whether they are adapting to the complexity what the bad guys are doing, and yeah, what could be the potential solution from the regulatory side. So maybe Lubos, you can start with that.
Thank you. Well, definitely, but this is something, always, every regulation, every legal kind of framework is only following the developments in the real world, and it's always behind, it's lagging, definitely. But this is, for example, what is addressed by the Code of Practice, and also what we are envisaging for the next installment of the Code of Practice. There's a pillar called Integrity of Services, and it is really looking at these kind of developments and abuses of the systemic nature of the platform. So, and Facebook have a whole area of their own kind of regulation, or looking at that area called authentic behavior. And this is aimed at those. So yeah, regulators and also the social media themselves and their providers are aware of these developments, and it is needed to address them. So basically, what I have to say on that. But for example, it's a new kind of legislation coming also for the deep fakes, for example, in a specific use of them. And I think it's when they're using in so-called revenge porn. And this is also, let's not forget, there are many things, that these things are conducted, these misbehaviors are made by individuals. And you have to also have laws, against those, acts by individuals. So for example, you can have criminal law that would, prohibit doing, deep fakes, in certain areas. And you have to start there. Of course, systematically, you want to catch it while happening on the platforms, and there's a systemic kind of problem. But you also can address this as a kind of individual problem in a society by legislating for new laws. And these laws, like in deepfakes, in certain uses, are coming. Thank you.
So Felix, do you have anything to add?
Sure. So we talk a lot about the DSA at EU level, especially, and I think this is the right moment to also discuss the European Democracy Action Plan a little more, because European Democracy Action Plan has promised us special legislation on sponsored political content online. And I think that when we talk about sponsored political content or political ads, we should choose a definition as broad as possible, because sock puppets, in my view, are paid influencers. So if I go and I buy like 500 accounts, or I pay people to spread my messages, I think that's pretty much what Bloomberg did in the US primaries, for instance. I think this kind of paying, or this way of paying for content should also count as political ads. And I think it should be covered by the same transparency and disclosure requirements than what Facebook would like us to frame as ads, which is what you can buy on their customer portal. So I think if we work also creatively here and there with definitions, we can use the new initiatives to cover quite a broad range of emerging and unfolding threats.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this part of questions. We have another set of questions, basically asking your opinion about upcoming new code of practice. And Lubos already mentioned that. Maybe you can tell more about it. What we are expecting, and what would be your take on this? So what do you think about the new initiative?
Well, I think it is important that we are talking about it, and as I understand it, the Commission is quite ambitious about unrolling this or rolling out these rules as soon as possible. Now we have to be careful, to be not over optimistic, so to say, because these things are also tied to DSA, the Digital Services Act. So in terms of, for example, any accountability and liabilities, and even sanctioning of the platform for not doing enough. It is really a question of the future, and it's not anywhere in sight. But what we are trying to do, and we as ERGA are advising the Commission in that, but there are many other stakeholders involved. But what we are trying to say is that the transparency needs to be increased. Again, it seems probably a bit boring to talk about transparency, but it is really a basis for anything else here, and it is not good. What is currently in the code of practice. This kind of provisions that the platform pledged to. But when you try to actually measure what is happening, actually see how those things are working on the ground, so to say, in the member states, it is very lacking. For example, you are only getting very aggregated data. Sometimes you are reading, how many accounts have been taken down, but not even in Europe, for example. It's all the world, or numbers from Indonesia. And when you are trying to see how the things are happening in the EU, it's not helping in any way. And when we're, for example, monitoring what happened during the European elections with these measures, again, every member state is different in this regard. And it was European elections, but, the things were happening in the national context. But to get numbers and data and, accounts and things like that, broken down on an individual member state, this just wasn't available for us to get. So these things need to be improved immensely, really, in the next installment of the Code of Practice. And then to have a kind of oversight structure. And again, this is not because, to actually regulate and, somehow punish the platforms for not doing enough. But to be able to verify those numbers, for example, you need to have a framework to do that. So the kind of thing that we did for the first installment of the Code of Practice, to have really written in the Code of Practice and to have clear framework that everybody knows what is supposed to do on the side of platforms, but also on the side of regulators, if we are the ones endowed with those obligations, or on the side of Commission and anywhere else. For example, researchers might be involved much more than previously, because now we have also an organization called EDMO, European Digital Media Observatory, and this is created or founded by the Commission, but it's an independent institution that is collecting researchers, gathering researchers that are working on the access to data from the platforms, and also assessing these data, and it is specifically aimed at the spread of disinformation, but also fact checking, for example. So I think that now we have much more wider basis how to approach these things, not only from regulatory perspective or I don't know, just from the perspective of the Commission, but there are many other stakeholders now involved. Now we need to have that framework written so every side of that system, can really use their expertise and their capacity to the most, useful way. So hopefully, we are now starting the discussion. The first discussion in this regard was yesterday, so it only started. But I think, we already know many things that should be improved. So hopefully the Commission will listen and the platforms would pledge that.
But what are the lessons learned from the previous code of conduct, code of practice? So does that kind of framework actually work? So perhaps there are some other way to go apart from code of practices. Maybe, okay, there is this agreement and framework and etc. But so what is the reason of having it if it's not really implemented? So yeah, it's just another provocation, but maybe there is another way to go for that.
Problem, the other way is to go, with the proper state regulation, all the way. But for that, you need to have a legislation. Now, on European level, you are, very much limited on what, the EU can do in this regard, as apart from the member states. Now, if you let the member states deal with it, the problem is that, you will have a patchwork of different legislation, that would be really hard to navigate. But the platforms you are dealing with are global. So, for example, I'm coming from Slovakia, and to think that we will have a detailed law on fighting disinformation that would actually work, because the platforms will listen and do everything to stem this kind of development in Slovakia is kind of laughable. So this is we need a common approach. Now, for that you need a legislation to have a regulation. But the only legislation we have is e-commerce directive currently, and now the DSA is in works. But if you are looking what is there in DSA, it also doesn't envisage any kind of proper legislation or hard legislation of disinformation. The only thing that disinformation are mentioned there is the risk assessment by the platforms themselves, and there is a development in code of conduct, so to say. So it's not code of practice, but code of conduct, and it's invoking to use that in a kind of co-regulatory fashion to deal with disinformation. So again, I don't think we are going toward a real regulation. But what we can do, and it is also in the European Democracy Action Plan, it's called co-regulatory backstop, and that's a kind of improvement, because the last installment of code of practice was clear self-regulation. Now we are moving toward co-regulation. So that's what I'm actually referring to when I'm saying that we need a framework that put at least basic accountability there and much more robust transparency. So you have a way how to tell the platforms what data you need and how to verify that you are getting the data that you need. I think this is the most feasible vision that we can have currently. But and I think it will help. Definitely help if it is written like I'm saying. And just one last thing. Also, the code of practice, the last one, was helpful, I think, because we at least moved somewhere. Before that, we didn't have anything. Now we have at least, the databases of political advertising, things that we didn't have before. And we have many other information on how these things are working on the platforms. But we need to learn from that and move, forward. And this is much needed, definitely.
Felix, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks. Because I was actually working at the Commission on the Code of Practice while in the process of designing it, and also receiving all of these self-reporting documents from the platforms. I think a huge problem about it in the first version was that we basically gave the platforms a talking point, and we gave them the possibility to say, hey, we're working with EU governments, we're working with the EU Commission. without forcing them to prove that any of what they said they were doing was actually effective. And I think that was not very constructive, and maybe even not very democratic, because basically we gave them a public mandate to crack down on what was partly lawful speech. So when they told us, well, we took down 1 million accounts spreading this info, but we didn't know like how this may have impacted the user rights, freedom of speech. So I think, that's indeed problematic. So I am a big fan of the regulatory backstop, and also integrating the new code of practice more firmly in the DSA framework. I do think that it is a very important tool, the code of practice, and I think the Commission should really deliver on it. I think it's great that the Commission is all excited about the DSA, and we should focus on it, but we can't forget that it will take a long while until the DSA will be enacted. And we have, as I mentioned, several watershed elections in Germany this year, and I think that real proper transparency and agency for users, for researchers, for election authorities could hugely increase the resilience of the German election process, because we're seeing major disinfo campaigns, coordinated hate speech against minorities on platforms there already. So I hope that the Commission will see this as an opportunity and really force the platforms to deliver this time.
Actually, we are approaching to the end of the discussion, and we are a bit of short of time. So I will ask one more last question, which is actually related to the latest developments in regards to online environment, and our audience really would like to know. So do you have any opinion, or what really happened in Australia when we're talking about Facebook and Google discussing and pushbacking to Australian initiatives and legislation? So do you see any far-reaching consequences to that? Because some commentators already have said so. It might be some kind of test for the rest of the world, and some similar initiatives are also popping up, and reaction to those initiatives, can be some kind of test for others as well. So what would be your take on that?
So I think it was a very interesting case. I don't even want to judge Facebook's move to say basically that they wanted to withdraw from this new law and not pay publishers for media content that was being shared on their platform. I think that's kind of understandable from a business perspective, but I think they acted in a very arrogant way, because they seem to think that they are not reliant on news content, on quality media on their platforms at all for their ad revenue, that people would click away anyways. But then we saw 2 days later, like Facebook taking a U-turn and suddenly going back to the negotiating table with the Australian government. And I think the insight that they had was that they indeed need quality media on their platforms for their value proposition, because the quality media are the only bulwark they have against disinformation and hate and all this malicious content that festers on their platforms. So I think they might rethink now the role of quality media has for their revenue model.
Lubos, do you have anything to add?
Developments very closely, so I don't want to get deep into that. But what is extremely important is that democracies just need quality media, and it is absolutely clear that with social media, it came, their revenues just plummeted, and the problem is systemic again, And I don't think just to force platforms to have a kind of contractual agreements with media and give them money, is the systemic solution that we are looking for. So, for example, I think we need a kind of systemic treatment of content, in digital in general. And for that, for example, when we are talking about digital services, it is a very horizontal rule. It's social media are only a very, very small part of that. And this is also argument why, the Commission is saying, okay, why we are not doing more, about disinformation or harmful content, because this is not that kind of instrument, I will say. And I think it is important to recognize that, okay, if this is horizontal kind of legislation, we need another one, on top of that would deal with content, that would also deal with media content on the platforms. And I think this is a proper way by legislation to address the systemic issues that we currently have in the environment. No just cases, with the contractual agreements between media and the platform.
Thank you. With this, I will finish discussion. Thank you very much for interesting talk. It seems that the problem of harmful effects and malicious use of social media will not go away, and there will be more and more initiatives coming up on how to solve that problem and what to do about that. So most probably we will have to return to this discussion again and again. I'm sure you are in this discussion all the time, but I mean we at the StratCom COE most probably will come back to the topic again for some of the next webinars. So thank you again, and thanks to all our audience for multiple questions. Our next webinar will be conducted on next Wednesday, on the 3rd of March, when we will discuss Russian military exercises from 2020 and upcoming exercises in 2021. So I hope to see you again next week, same time and same place. Goodbye.